The champagne in my glass had gone flat an hour ago, tiny bubbles clinging to the crystal sides like failed promises. I stared at the amber liquid catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Manhattan penthouse, watching the way it refracted into smaller fragments of gold. 3 years ago today, I'd stood in a cathedral wearing Vera Wang and promising forever to a man whose eyes had seemed to hold entire galaxies. Now, those same eyes couldn't be bothered to focus on his phone long enough to answer my call. I pressed redial for the 6th time, listening to the international ringtone that meant Nathan was still somewhere in Europe. Monaco, his assistant had said when I'd called the office this morning, trying to keep my voice light and wifely rather than desperate and abandoned. A last-minute business meeting that couldn't be postponed, even for our anniversary. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before clicking to voicemail. Nathan's recorded voice was smooth, professional, giving nothing away. "You've reached Nathan Carver. Leave a message." I ended the call without speaking, my reflection in the window showing a woman I barely recognized. 28 years old, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, sitting alone in a penthouse that could house 6 families comfortably, waiting for a husband who had more important things to do than remember the day he'd vowed to forsake all others. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd known what Nathan was when I married him. Known about the import-export business that was neither import nor export. Known about the meetings that happened in restaurants after hours with men whose names were never mentioned in daylight. Known about the money that moved through accounts like water through a sieve, clean on one side and crystalline on the other. What I hadn't known was how thoroughly I would disappear into the role of Mrs. Nathan Carver, how completely my own identity would be absorbed into his shadow, until I became nothing more than an accessory, perfectly maintained and strategically displayed when needed, locked away and forgotten when not. My phone buzzed with a notification. Instagram. My thumb hovered over the icon. Some sixth sense warning me not to look, but I opened it anyway. The way you press on a bruise to confirm it still hurts. Brianna's story appeared at the top of my feed, that little rainbow circle pulsing with recent activity. Brianna, 24 years old and blessed with the kind of effortless beauty that didn't require strategic contouring or expensive procedures. Brianna, who worked as a consultant for one of Nathan's legitimate businesses. Brianna, who I'd met exactly 3 times at charity galas where she'd smiled at me with perfect teeth and called me Mrs. Carver in a voice like honey poured over broken glass. I tapped her story. The image loaded slowly, each pixel a tiny betrayal assembling itself into a complete picture of my humiliation. Brianna in a white bikini that probably cost more than some people's monthly salary, her skin golden against the blue of what was unmistakably the Mediterranean. Her head tilted toward the camera, lips pursed in that practiced pout that somehow never looked ridiculous on people born after 1995. And there, just over her shoulder, close enough that his proximity was deliberate, was Nathan, my husband, wearing the sunglasses I'd bought him for his birthday, the Rolex I'd had engraved for our first anniversary, the swimming trunks I'd seen hanging in our closet just yesterday before he'd left for his business meeting. The caption read, "When the view is almost as perfect as the company Dr. Monaco life, Yacht Week, living my best life." I studied the image with the same detached focus I'd once used to analyze paintings in the museum Nathan and I visited during our courtship, when he was still pretending to be interested in culture, rather than just acquisition. Every detail told a story. The angle of Nathan's shoulders, relaxed in a way they never were at home. The proximity of their bodies, comfortable and familiar. The timestamp, 43 minutes ago, which meant he'd been ignoring my calls while posing for selfies with his mistress. The penthouse suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in despite its 3,000 square feet of luxury. I stood, my legs steadier than they had any right to be, and walked through rooms designed by an architect whose name carried weight in circles that mattered. Past the Hockney in the hallway, the Kusama installation in the library, the custom furniture that had taken 6 months to manufacture in Italy. Past the wedding photos in their Tiffany frames, capturing a version of us that had never really existed outside the lens. In Nathan's study, I stopped in front of the abstract painting that dominated the wall behind his mahogany desk, a Rothko that had cost more than most people earned in a decade. I'd always hated it, the way its blocks of color seemed to bleed into each other like wounds that wouldn't heal. Nathan loved it, said it spoke to the complexity of emotion, the way different states could exist simultaneously without resolution. I reached behind it now, my fingers finding the small safe embedded in the wall that Nathan thought I didn't know about. He'd been careless once, 18 months ago, punching in the code while I stood in the doorway asking about dinner reservations. He hadn't noticed me notice, hadn't registered the way my mind had cataloged the sequence of numbers like a computer filing information for future use. The safe opened with a quiet click that sounded like a door closing on one life and opening to another. Inside, exactly where I knew it would be, sat a small silver pen drive, no larger than my thumb, but containing enough information to dismantle Nathan's entire empire. I'd discovered it by accident 6 months ago while looking for the deed to the beach house in the Hamptons, had seen the label in Nathan's precise handwriting. Insurance. I'd copied the contents onto an identical drive that night, replacing the original and hiding my copy in a hollowed-out book on our bedroom shelf, a collection of Elizabeth Barrett Browning poems Nathan had never once touched. Then I'd waited, not knowing what I was waiting for, only that someday I might need leverage, might need proof, might need a way out. Today, apparently, was that day. I grabbed both drives, the original and my copy, and left the study without looking back. In our bedroom, I pulled a small Hermes bag from my closet, the kind of understated luxury that could blend into a crowd if necessary. I packed quickly, methodically, my hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd mentally rehearsed this moment more times than she'd admit. Designer clothes that could be sold if needed. The diamond studs my mother had given me, the only jewelry that predated Nathan. My passport, cash from the emergency fund I'd been building in small increments, enough to disappear for a while if I was careful. I left my wedding ring on the nightstand, the platinum band catching the late afternoon light the same way my champagne glass had hours earlier. Beside it, I placed my phone, the one Nathan had given me, the one whose calls and locations he could track. Let him think I was still here, still waiting, still the obedient wife in her golden cage. The penthouse elevator descended silently, carrying me away from 3 years of carefully constructed illusions. I watched the numbers decrease, each floor a small deletion of the person I'd been. By the time I reached the lobby, nodded to the doorman who would later tell Nathan I'd left carrying only a small bag and wearing sunglasses despite the cloud cover, I was already someone else. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. The city swallowed me into its afternoon crowds and I let it. Just another woman in designer clothes walking with purpose toward a destination she couldn't quite name. My mind was already working through possibilities, connections, people Nathan had mentioned and then dismissed. People who existed on the periphery of his world with their own agendas and grievances. One name kept surfacing, rising through the chaos of my thoughts like a life raft in stormy water. Dominic Castellano. Nathan's former partner, his rival, the man he'd edged out of a lucrative territory dispute 2 years ago. The man whose name he only spoke with a mixture of respect and contempt, which meant he was dangerous, capable, and nursing a wound that had never properly healed. I'd met Dominic exactly once, at a charity gala Nathan couldn't avoid attending. He'd been courteous, distant, his eyes passing over me the way people look at art in a gallery when they're really thinking about something else. But I'd seen the way he'd watched Nathan across the room later that evening. The calculation in his gaze, the patient assessment of a predator who knew his moment would come. That moment, I decided as I hailed a taxi and gave an address in Brooklyn I'd memorized but never visited, was now. The revenge might be served cold, as the saying went, but mine would be calculated, devastating, and delivered by the one person Nathan had underestimated completely. The wife he'd forgotten was watching, learning, and waiting for her own moment to strike. The taxi dropped me in front of a building that didn't match the luxury I'd grown accustomed to, but radiated a different kind of power. Red brick, pre-war construction, the kind of place that had witnessed decades of the city's evolution and absorbed its secrets into the mortar. Dominic Castellano's legitimate business operated from the third floor, a consulting firm that advised on international acquisitions and navigated the complicated terrain where legal enterprise met less savory necessities. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the weight of the pen drives in my bag suddenly feeling heavier, more consequential. This wasn't just leaving Nathan. This was declaring war. Choosing a side in a conflict I'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. Once I walked through that door, there would be no returning to the penthouse, no reconciliation over couples therapy and renewed vows. There would only be the aftermath, and I would have to live in whatever landscape remained when the dust settled. The building's lobby smelled like old wood and industrial cleaner, a stark contrast to the penthouse's carefully curated scent of expensive candles and fresh flowers. I took the stairs rather than the elevator, needing the physical exertion to steady my nerves, my heels clicking against worn marble in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The third-floor hallway was empty, lined with frosted glass doors bearing the names of various businesses. Castellano Consulting occupied the corner suite, its door slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the corridor. I pushed it open slowly, the bell above announcing my arrival with a delicate chime that seemed too cheerful for the moment. A reception area greeted me, tastefully furnished but not ostentatious. A woman in her 50s sat behind a desk, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp and assessing as they traveled over me. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either, just waited with the patience of someone who'd learned to read situations before speaking. "I need to see Dominic Castellano," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell him Cassandra Carver is here with a business proposition he'll want to hear." Her eyebrow lifted fractionally at Nathan's surname, but she reached for her phone without comment, pressing a button and speaking in low tones I couldn't quite catch. A moment later, she nodded toward a door to her left. "Mr. Castellano will see you. Third door on the right." The hallway beyond was quieter, thicker carpet absorbing sound. I could hear my own breathing, feel my pulse in my throat as I approached the indicated door. It stood open, and through it I could see Dominic seated behind a desk, reading something on his computer screen with the focused intensity of a man who didn't waste time on distractions. He looked up as I entered, and I saw the moment of recognition followed immediately by calculation. He'd aged well in the 2 years since I'd seen him, 42 now, and wearing it with the kind of authority that came from surviving in a world where weakness was fatal. His suit was impeccable, charcoal gray with a barely perceptible pinstripe, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his hands folded on the desk in front of him with the stillness of someone who knew the value of patience. "Mrs. Carver," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent that spoke of Mediterranean roots and expensive international schools. "This is unexpected. Should I offer condolences or congratulations on whatever's brought you to my door?" I closed the door behind me and walked to the chair across from his desk, sitting without waiting for an invitation. "Neither. I'm here to offer you something you've wanted for 2 years. Nathan's complete destruction." His expression didn't change, but I saw interest flicker in his dark eyes. "That's quite an opening statement. What makes you think I want any such thing?" "Because he took the Port Authority contract from you," I said, pulling out my phone, the burner I'd purchased from a bodega 3 blocks away with cash. I opened the photo I'd screenshot of Brianna's story and turned it toward him. "And because men like Nathan don't just take territory, they take pride, reputation, the things that matter more than money. He made you look weak in front of people whose respect you need. That's not something you forgive." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied me with new interest. "You're more observant than Nathan gave you credit for. But observation and action are very different things, Mrs. Carver. What exactly are you proposing?" I reached into my bag and placed both pen drives on his desk. Everything Nathan thought was secure. Bank account numbers, Shell Corporation documentation, details of shipments and their actual contents versus declared manifests. Enough to either bury him legally or leverage him into giving you back everything he took and more. He didn't reach for the drives, didn't even look at them. His eyes stayed on me, reading something in my face that I wasn't sure I wanted him to see. "Why? He's your husband. Whatever his failings, you chose him. You stayed with him for 3 years. Why turn on him now?" The question hit harder than I'd expected, touching the raw place where my humiliation lived. I pulled up Brianna's story again, letting him see the full image this time. Because I called him 6 times today, our anniversary. He didn't answer once. 43 minutes after my last call, his mistress posted this from his yacht in Monaco, the yacht I thought he was too busy to take me on because of work commitments. Dominic's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Infidelity is painful, but it's hardly rare in our world. Most wives find ways to accommodate it or look the other way. What makes you different? "I'm not different," I said, the truth of it settling into my bones. "I'm just done. Done being invisible, done being convenient, done being the beautiful accessory he displays when it serves his purposes and ignores when it doesn't. He made me feel like nothing today, like I didn't matter enough to even warrant a text message, so I'm going to make him feel the same way when everything he's built crumbles around him." A smile ghosted across Dominic's lips, there and gone so quickly I almost missed it. Revenge, then, the oldest motivation in the world. He finally picked up one of the pen drives, turning it over in his fingers. "And what do you want in return for this information? Money? Protection? A way out of the country?" "All of that," I said. "But mostly, I want to watch him fall. I want to be there when it happens, when he realizes that the wife he dismissed as irrelevant was the one who destroyed him. I want him to know it was me." Dominic stood, walking to the window that overlooked the Brooklyn street below. Dusk was falling, the city's lights beginning to sparkle in the gathering darkness. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost gentle. "You understand what you're asking for, what this will cost you. Nathan's world becomes your world. His enemies become your enemies. You'll be marked as a traitor, someone who broke the most fundamental code. There's no going back from that, no returning to civilian life." "I stopped being a civilian the day I married him," I said. "I just didn't admit it to myself until today. Now I'm choosing which side of that world I want to be on. I'm choosing yours." He turned to face me, leaning against the window frame with his arms crossed. "And you trust me? You barely know me. For all you know, I could take this information, use it, and leave you with nothing. Or worse, tell Nathan you came here and let him deal with you however he sees fit." The thought had occurred to me, had circled my mind during the entire taxi ride. But something in the way Dominic had looked at Nathan that night at the gala, something in the careful distance he'd maintained, told me he operated by a different code. "You could," I agreed, "but you won't. Because unlike Nathan, you understand that loyalty has to be earned, not demanded. And because having someone on the inside who knows all of Nathan's secrets, all his routines and weaknesses, is worth more than a simple betrayal." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing me with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen for the first time in years. Finally, he nodded. Decision made. 6 months, he said. "We take 6 months to do this properly. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes with Nathan lead to bodies in the river. You'll stay at one of my properties, somewhere he won't think to look. You'll work with my people, walk them through everything on these drives, fill in the gaps that documentation can't capture. And when we're ready, when every piece is in position, we move." "And then?" I asked. "And then?" Dominic said, picking up his phone and typing a rapid message. "We burn his empire to the ground and build something better from the ashes. Something legitimate, something that won't require us to constantly look over our shoulders or wonder which associate might be wearing a wire." His phone buzzed with a response, and he nodded to himself. "Marco will take you to the apartment in Red Hook. It's secure, comfortable, under a corporate lease that can't be traced back to me directly. You'll have security, discretion, and time to process what you're doing." He paused, then added more quietly, "And time to grieve, if you need it. Even bad marriages deserve mourning when they end." The unexpected kindness in his words cracked something in my carefully maintained composure. I blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall. Not here. Not in front of this man who needed to see me as an asset, rather than a victim. "Thank you," I managed. "Don't thank me yet," Dominic said, returning to his desk and picking up both pen drives. "We haven't done anything except agree to mutual destruction. Thank me when Nathan is in handcuffs, and you're free to rebuild your life however you choose." A knock at the door announced Marco's arrival. A compact man in his 30s with observant eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested military training. Dominic introduced us briefly, then handed me off with instructions that were polite, but firm. I was to go nowhere without Marco's clearance, speak to no one from my old life, and resist any urge to check on what Nathan might be doing or saying. As Marco led me back through the hallway, I glanced over my shoulder once. Dominic stood in his doorway, watching me leave with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he turned back into his office, and I heard the quiet click of his door closing, a sound that felt like a seal being set on a contract, written in consequences and revenge. The apartment in Red Hook was beautiful in an understated way. Exposed brick and high ceilings, furniture that managed to be both comfortable and sophisticated. Marco showed me the security features, the panic button by the bed, the reinforced door, the cameras monitoring the hallway. Then he left me alone with my thoughts, and the gathering night pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood in the center of the living room, still wearing the dress I'd put on that morning when I'd still believed Nathan might remember our anniversary, might come home early with flowers and apologies and promises to do better. The woman who'd put on that dress felt like a stranger now, someone naive and hopeful who I'd left behind in the penthouse along with my wedding ring. My new phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Dominic. "First rule of war. Know when you've crossed the line you can't uncross. Sleep well, Cassandra. Tomorrow we start planning how to destroy your husband." I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, seeing the ghost of who I'd been overlaid with the shadow of who I was becoming. Then I turned away, toward the bedroom, and whatever future I'd just chosen, and didn't look back. The following 6 months unfolded with the methodical precision of a military campaign. I spent my days in Dominic's Brooklyn office, sitting across from accountants who explained how Nathan moved money through layered corporations like a shell game, lawyers who mapped out which laws he'd broken and how to prove it, and federal agents who operated in that gray space where prosecutorial discretion met strategic convenience. At night, I returned to the Red Hook apartment that had become both sanctuary and cell, its walls closing in as I realized the full scope of what Nathan had built, and more disturbingly, my own complicity in never asking the right questions. I'd been willfully blind. I understood now. Choosing ignorance because knowledge would have required action, I wasn't ready to take. Dominic was present for most of the sessions, sitting quietly while I walked his team through Nathan's routines, his contacts, the small details that seemed insignificant, but revealed patterns. Where he kept his second phone, the one he thought I didn't know about. Which restaurants he used for which kinds of meetings. The assistant who scheduled his legitimate appointments versus the one who arranged his other business. Tell me about the yacht, Dominic said one afternoon in late October, 4 weeks into our collaboration. We were alone in his office, his team having departed for the day, the autumn light slanting through the windows in golden bars that caught the dust motes floating between us. I looked up from the financial document I'd been annotating, my chest tightening at the mention of the vessel that had started all of this. The Belladonna. He bought it 2 years ago, registered under a Cayman Islands corporation. He said it was for client entertainment. Client entertainment, Dominic repeated, his tone dry. Is that what we're calling it now? He pulled up something on his computer, turning the screen toward me. Security footage from a Monaco marina, dated the day of our anniversary. Nathan and Brianna boarding the yacht, her hand in his, both of them laughing at something I would never hear. The image shouldn't have hurt anymore. I'd spent 4 weeks dismantling my marriage in spreadsheets and testimony, reducing 3 years of my life to evidence in a federal case. But seeing them together, seeing the ease of his smile, the way he touched her lower back with casual possession, sent a spike of pain through my chest that stole my breath. I need you to tell me everything about her, Dominic said, not unkindly, but with the insistence of someone who understood that sentiment had no place in strategy. Brianna Hartwell. How they met, how long it's been going on, what she knows about his business. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. They met at a gallery opening 18 months ago. Nathan collects contemporary art, uses it to launder money sometimes, buying pieces for inflated prices from sellers who are actually shell corporations he controls. She was there with her previous boyfriend, some hedge fund analyst. Nathan approached her, charmed her, had her hired at one of his companies within a week. And the relationship? Started almost immediately, as far as I can tell. I found hotel receipts in his suit pocket about a year ago, charged to one of the business accounts. The Carlisle, always the same suite. When I asked him about it, he said it was for out-of-town clients who needed last-minute accommodations. I laughed without humor. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Dominic's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested understanding, perhaps even sympathy. What does she know about the business? The real business. I thought back to the few conversations I'd overheard, the fragments of information I'd pieced together from Nathan's careless comments. More than she should. Nathan likes to impress people, especially women. He would talk about deals in vague terms, make himself sound more powerful than he was. I think he told her about the Port Authority contract, about beating you for it. She mentioned it once at a gala, asked me if I was excited about Nathan's big victory over his competitor. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine emotion flicker across Dominic's face. Anger, quickly controlled but unmistakable. Did he tell her how he won that contract? The details? I don't know, I admitted. But she's not stupid, and she's ambitious. If Nathan was using her as a sounding board, confiding in her the way husbands confide in wives, she could know a lot. Everything, possibly. Dominic stood, pacing to the window in a movement that had become familiar over our weeks of working together. He was a pacer when he thought, I'd learned, someone who needed physical movement to process information. Then she's a liability to him. And liabilities have a way of becoming problems that need solving in Nathan's world. The implication made my stomach turn. You think he'd hurt her? I think Nathan does what's necessary to protect himself, Dominic said carefully. And if he suspects we're building a case, if he starts to feel the walls closing in, he'll eliminate anything that could be used against him. That includes mistresses who know too much. A thought occurred to me, cold and calculating, the kind of strategic thinking I'd been developing under Dominic's tutelage. Unless she turns on him first, unless she decides her own freedom is worth more than whatever loyalty she feels to a married man who'll never leave his wife. Dominic turned from the window, looking at me with new appraisal. You want to flip her, use her testimony to strengthen the case. I want her to understand what I've learned, I said. That Nathan Carver protects Nathan Carver, and everyone else is expendable, including beautiful 24-year-old consultants who think they're special because they got a ride on his yacht. A smile curved Dominic's lips, predatory and approving. That's good. That's the kind of thinking that wins wars. He returned to his desk, pulling up a file on his computer. The federal prosecutor on Nathan's case is a woman named Sarah Chen. She's built her career on RICO cases, taking down organized crime families. She'd love to have someone like Brianna as a witness, someone young and sympathetic who can testify about how Nathan seduced and manipulated her. Will she go for it? I asked. Brianna, I mean. She must know what kind of man Nathan is by now. People know a lot of things they choose not to acknowledge, Dominic said, looking at me meaningfully. Until circumstances force them to see clearly. You're proof of that. The words stung, because they were true. I had known on some level exactly who and what Nathan was. I'd just chosen the comfort of willful ignorance over the difficulty of uncomfortable truths. Until he'd made that choice impossible by humiliating me so completely that self-deception was no longer an option. Over the next 2 weeks, Dominic arranged for Sarah Chen to accidentally encounter Brianna at her favorite yoga studio in Tribeca. The federal prosecutor was good at her job, skilled at reading people and finding their pressure points. Within a week, Brianna had agreed to a preliminary conversation, attracted by the promise of immunity in exchange for testimony. I watched the video of that first interview from Dominic's office, Sarah Chen's team having set up cameras with Brianna's reluctant consent. She looked younger than her 24 years, her beauty somehow diminished by the harsh lighting of the federal building's conference room. She kept touching her necklace, a nervous gesture that suggested uncertainty beneath her composed exterior. Tell me about Nathan Carver, Sarah Chen prompted, her voice neutral, non-judgmental. How would you describe your relationship with him? Brianna's eyes flickered toward the camera, then away. We're close. He's been a mentor to me, professionally. Just professionally? A long pause, the sound of Brianna's breathing audible in the quiet room. We've been involved romantically for about 18 months. I know he's married. I know it's wrong. But he said his marriage was over, that they stayed together for appearances but lived separate lives. I felt Dominic's eyes on me, assessing my reaction. I kept my face carefully blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much the confirmation still hurt. I'd known, of course, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly, reduced to simple declarative sentences in a federal interview, made it real, in a way my own suspicions never had. Did Mr. Carver discuss his business with you? Sarah Chen continued. Sometimes. He liked to talk about his deals, make himself sound important. Brianna's voice carried a note of bitterness now, the first crack in her composed facade. He told me about beating out Dominic Castellano for some shipping contract, how he'd outsmarted everyone. He was proud of it. Did he explain how he won that contract? Brianna hesitated, legal survival warring with whatever loyalty she still felt toward Nathan. Finally, self-preservation won. He said he had people in the right places, that he knew how to make sure the decision-makers voted the right way. When I asked what that meant, he laughed and said some people respond better to carrots and others to sticks. Sarah Chen leaned forward. Brianna, I need you to be very clear. Did Nathan Carver admit to bribing or threatening officials to secure that contract? Another pause, longer this time. Then, quietly, yes. I watched Dominic's reaction, saw the satisfaction flash across his face before he controlled it. This was what we needed. Corroboration from someone Nathan had trusted, someone he'd been careless around because he'd underestimated her importance. The interview continued for another hour, Brianna gradually revealing more as Sarah Chen skillfully extracted information, like a surgeon removing poison from a wound. By the end, she'd provided enough testimony to support multiple charges, bribery, fraud, money laundering, the foundation of a RICO case that could bring Nathan's entire operation crashing down. "She'll need protection," I said when the video ended. "When Nathan finds out she's cooperating, he'll try to silence her." Dominic nodded. "Witness protection, new identity, relocation. The federal government is very good at making people disappear when they need to. She'll testify, and then she'll vanish into whatever life she builds with her second chance." "And us?" I asked. "When do we get our second chances?" He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Over the past 6 weeks, our relationship had evolved beyond simple alliance. We spent hours together daily, working through the complexities of Nathan's empire, planning strategy, occasionally sharing meals in his office when sessions ran late. I'd learned that Dominic drank his coffee black, that he had a sister in Milan he called every Sunday, that he'd once wanted to be an architect before his father's death pulled him into the family business. And he'd learned things about me, too. That I took my tea with honey and lemon, that I'd studied art history before meeting Nathan, that I sometimes woke at 3 a.m. from nightmares about being trapped in the penthouse's glass walls. We'd built something in those hours, understanding perhaps, or recognition of kinship between two people who'd chosen difficult paths for complicated reasons. "Our second chances start when Nathan is behind bars," Dominic said quietly. "When you're legally free of him and safe from any retaliation. When we've dismantled everything he built and proven that people who break their word, who betray their partners and dismiss their wives, eventually face consequences." "Revenge," I said, echoing our first conversation. "Justice," he corrected. "There's a difference, even if the end result looks similar." As autumn deepened into winter, the case against Nathan solidified into something prosecutable, indictable, inevitable. Sarah Chen filed charges in early December, targeting not just Nathan, but his entire network, associates, and shell corporations, and the web of corruption he'd spent years constructing. The indictment was sealed, the arrests planned for early January, giving Nathan just enough time to relax into the holiday season before the walls came crashing down. I spent Christmas Eve in the Red Hook apartment, watching snow fall over the East River, while Dominic worked late at his office, finalizing details with the federal team. My phone, the burner I'd been using for 6 months, buzzed with a message from him. "It's done. Arrests happen January 3rd. You should stay inside until it's over. Let Marco bring you anything you need. And Cassandra, for what it's worth, you did the right thing." I wasn't sure if I believed that. The right thing, the moral thing, felt like abstractions when measured against the concrete reality of what I'd done. I'd betrayed my husband, destroyed his life's work, ensured he'd spend years or decades in prison. That it was deserved, that he'd earned every consequence coming his way, didn't change the fundamental truth that I'd crossed a line most people never even approached. But as I looked out at the city sparkling with Christmas lights, thinking about Nathan somewhere in Manhattan, probably with Brianna, probably laughing and drinking expensive champagne without a thought for the wife he'd discarded, or the reckoning approaching like an avalanche, I felt something settle in my chest. Not quite peace, but purpose. Not quite forgiveness for myself, but acceptance of who I'd become and what I'd chosen. Tomorrow was Christmas. In 9 days, Nathan's world would end. And somewhere in the aftermath, I would have to figure out how to build a new life from the ruins of the old one, a life where I was defined by my own choices rather than someone else's convenience. The snow continued to fall, covering the city in white, and I watched until the lights blurred and sleep finally claimed me in the chair by the window, my phone still clutched in my hand, waiting for the new year and everything it would bring. January 3rd arrived with the kind of cold that turned the city brittle, bare trees crackling in the wind off the river. I woke early, before dawn, too anxious to sleep, despite having nowhere to be. Nothing to do except wait for news that Nathan had been arrested. Marco had stationed himself outside my apartment door since midnight. a silent sentinel ensuring I stayed safe and stayed put. Dominic had been explicit in his instructions. I was to remain inside, avoid windows, speak to no one. Nathan's arrest would happen simultaneously with dozens of others, a coordinated sweep designed to prevent anyone from warning others or destroying evidence. But until it was complete, until every target was in custody, I was vulnerable. A loose end that Nathan might try to tie up if he suspected what was coming. My phone buzzed at 6:17. Dominic. It's happening now. FBI executing warrants across the city. Nathan's penthouse is first. Stay where you are. I imagined the scene I wasn't witnessing. Federal agents swarming the building I'd called home, flashing badges at the doorman who'd greeted me every morning for 3 years, taking the private elevator to the penthouse where Nathan was probably still in bed. Maybe alone, maybe with Brianna, though she'd supposedly been relocated to a safe house pending her testimony. Another text, 30 minutes later. He's in custody. Resisted initially, but his lawyers convinced him to cooperate. They're processing him now, booking, fingerprinting, the whole production. You're safe, Cassandra. It's over. But it wasn't over. Not really. This was just the beginning of a different kind of war. One fought in courtrooms and depositions, in plea negotiations and witness testimony. The part where Nathan would fight back with every resource at his disposal, hiring the best defense attorneys money could buy, using his connections to try to discredit witnesses and poke holes in the prosecution's case. The part where I would have to decide how visible I wanted to be, whether to testify publicly or remain in the shadows, letting the evidence speak for itself while I rebuilt my life somewhere Nathan couldn't reach. Dominic arrived at my apartment that afternoon, looking tired but satisfied, his usually immaculate appearance slightly rumpled after what I assumed had been an all-night coordination session with the federal team. Marco let him in without comment, then disappeared down the hallway to give us privacy. "Show me," I said, before he could speak. He pulled up a news article on his phone, turning it toward me. The headline read, "Massive federal bust targets organized crime network. Prominent businessman Nathan Carver among dozens arrested." Below it, a photograph of Nathan in handcuffs, being led from the penthouse I'd once thought of as home. His face was composed, carefully blank, but I could read the fury in the set of his jaw, the calculation in his eyes as he assessed the cameras and reporters surrounding him. "He knows," I said, studying the image. "He knows someone gave him up. He'll be trying to figure out who, running through the possibilities." "Let him wonder," Dominic replied, taking his phone back. "The investigation was thorough enough that there are multiple potential sources. Your information was critical, but it wasn't the only piece. We had surveillance, financial forensics, testimony from people he'd pressured or bribed over the years. He'll suspect a lot of people before he thinks of you." "Because I'm just the wife," I said bitterly. Too insignificant to be capable of bringing him down. Dominic's hand covered mine where it rested on the table between us, the first time he'd touched me beyond professional necessity. His palm was warm, calloused in a way Nathan's never had been. The hands of someone who'd built things, rather than just acquiring them. "You were never insignificant, Cassandra." Nathan's failure was in not recognizing what he had until it was too late. I looked up, meeting his dark eyes, seeing something there that made my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear or vengeance. Over the past 6 months, Dominic had been my ally, my teacher, my confessor in moments when the weight of what I was doing threatened to crush me. But somewhere in those long hours of collaboration, something else had developed, a connection I'd been carefully not examining too closely. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Now we wait for the trial," he said, not moving his hand from mine. "Sarah Chen thinks it'll be scheduled for late spring, early summer. 6 months, maybe 8, for both sides to prepare. Nathan will try to make a deal, offer to give up associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the evidence is strong enough that the prosecutors don't need to negotiate. They'll push for the maximum, make an example of him. And Brianna? Already in witness protection. New name, new city, new life. She'll testify via video link, face obscured, voice modulated. By the time the trial happens, she'll be so deep in her new identity that even if someone wanted to find her, they couldn't. He paused, then added more quietly, "She asked about you, actually. Wanted to know if you were safe, if you blamed her for the affair." The question surprised me. I'd spent so much energy hating Brianna, resenting her youth and beauty, and the effortless way she'd captured Nathan's attention. But now, knowing she'd been used just as thoroughly as I had, knowing she'd found the courage to testify despite the risk, I felt something closer to sympathy than anger. "Tell her," I said carefully, "that we were both victims of Nathan's particular brand of selfishness. That I hope her new life gives her the fresh start she deserves." Dominic smiled, approval warming his features. "You're more generous than most people would be in your position." "I'm tired of carrying hate," I admitted. "It's exhausting, burning energy on resentment when I could be using it to build something new." "Speaking of building something new," Dominic said, releasing my hand and pulling out a folder from his briefcase. "I have a proposition for you, the legitimate kind. Nothing illegal or morally questionable." I raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "I'm listening." He spread several documents across the table, architectural renderings and business plans, financial projections with numbers that made my head spin. "When this is over, when Nathan's assets are seized and liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, there will be opportunities. Properties sold at auction, businesses needing new management, pieces of his empire that can be repurposed for legal enterprises. I'm positioning myself to acquire several of them, convert them into legitimate operations." "That's smart," I said, studying the renderings. One showed a warehouse conversion into luxury apartments, another a restaurant space in Brooklyn. "But what does it have to do with me?" "I need a partner," Dominic said simply. "Someone who understands how Nathan's network operated, who has the intelligence and strategic thinking to help me transform these assets into something profitable and legal. Someone I can trust, which is a rare commodity in my world." He met my eyes. "I need you, Cassandra. Not as an employee or a consultant, but as an equal partner in building something better." The offer stunned me into silence. I'd spent 6 months dismantling my old life, preparing for Nathan's downfall. But I'd given almost no thought to what came after. I'd vaguely imagined returning to school, maybe finishing the art history degree I'd abandoned when I married Nathan, finding some quiet job in a gallery or museum where I could hide from my past. But this was different. This was active participation in creating a future, using the skills I'd developed during my marriage and the knowledge I'd gained during its dissolution to build something meaningful. Something mine. In a way, nothing had been mine since I'd signed the marriage license and become Mrs. Nathan Carver. "I don't have any capital to invest," I said, the practical objection emerging first. Nathan controlled all the finances. "When we divorce, I'll get something in the settlement, but it'll be tied up in legal proceedings for years." "I don't need your money," Dominic said. "I need your expertise, your insights, your ability to see patterns and opportunities. Your investment would be intellectual, strategic. We'd structure it as a partnership with equal equity once you're legally free to enter into such agreements." "Equal?" I repeated, skeptical. "You're putting up all the capital, taking all the financial risk. Why would you give me an equal stake?" He leaned back, regarding me with that calculating intensity I'd grown familiar with. "Because I've watched you work for 6 months, Cassandra. I've seen how you think, how you plan, how you turn obstacles into advantages. You're worth more than money. You're worth the kind of partnership that builds empires rather than just maintaining them. The compliment settled into my chest, warm and unfamiliar. Nathan had praised me occasionally, usually for how I looked or how well I'd played hostess at some important dinner. But he'd never respected my mind, never seen me as anything more than decorative and convenient. Dominic offering me partnership, real partnership with equal standing, felt like a validation I hadn't known I'd been craving. "I'll need time to think about it," I said, though part of me already knew what my answer would be. To consider what it would mean, getting involved in business with you when we barely know each other outside of this specific context. "We know each other better than most business partners do when they start," Dominic countered. "We've been through a crisis together, seen each other at our worst and our most determined. That's a stronger foundation than most partnerships have." He wasn't wrong. The past 6 months had forged a connection between us that felt more substantial than anything I'd built with Nathan in 3 years of marriage. We'd been allies in the truest sense, working toward a common goal with shared stakes and mutual trust. But there was something else, too. Something I'd been carefully not acknowledging in the spaces between our professional conversations. An awareness that had grown gradually, imperceptibly, until I'd found myself noticing the way Dominic's voice softened when he spoke to me. The way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking. The careful distance he maintained as though fighting an urge to close the space between us. "Is this just business?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. "Or is there something else you're proposing?" Dominic went very still, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "Right now, it's business. You're still married, still legally bound to Nathan, even if emotionally you've been done for months. I won't complicate your situation by adding elements that could be used against you in divorce proceedings, or make you question whether my offer of partnership comes with expectations you're not ready for." "And later?" I pressed, needing to know, needing to understand what this was becoming. "Later," he said quietly. "When you're free and safe, and I've had time to figure out who you are without Nathan's shadow, if there's something between us worth exploring, we can discuss it. But not now. Not when you're vulnerable, and I'm in a position of power. That's not how I do business. And it's definitely not how I'd approach anything personal with you." The answer was more honest than I'd expected, more respectful of my position than I'd experienced in years. Nathan had never considered my autonomy, my need to make choices from a place of strength rather than necessity. Dominic offering me space and time, even as he acknowledged the possibility of something more, felt like a gift I hadn't known to ask for. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than he probably understood. "For the offer, for the honesty, for treating me like someone whose choices matter." "Your choices have always mattered, Cassandra," he replied. "You just haven't been in a position to exercise them freely. That changes now. Everything changes now." He stayed for another hour, walking me through the business proposals in detail, explaining his vision for transforming Nathan's criminal empire into legitimate enterprises that could employ people, serve communities, create value rather than just extracting it. His enthusiasm was contagious, his strategic thinking impressive, and I found myself getting excited about possibilities I'd never considered. By the time he left, promising to send me more detailed documents to review, the winter sun was setting over the East River, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. I stood at the window, watching the city transform in the fading light, feeling something shift inside me. For 6 months, I'd been focused on destruction, on tearing down everything Nathan had built and ensuring he paid for his betrayals. But destruction was only half the story. The other half was creation, building something new from the rubble, something better and stronger and more honest. And maybe, I thought as I watched lights begin to sparkle across Brooklyn and Manhattan, maybe I could build that with Dominic. Not just businesses and partnerships, but a life that was truly mine, defined by choices I made freely rather than circumstances that trapped me. My phone buzzed with a message. Sarah Chen. Trial date set for June 15th. You'll need to be available for pre-trial depositions starting in March. Are you willing to testify if needed? I looked at the message for a long moment, considering what it would mean to face Nathan in court, to publicly detail his crimes and betrayals, to be cross-examined by defense attorneys who would try to make me look like a vindictive ex-wife rather than a credible witness. Then I thought about Brianna, young and scared, but brave enough to come forward. About the other victims of Nathan's greed and manipulation, people whose lives he'd damaged without thought or remorse. About the woman I'd been 6 months ago, waiting by the phone for a husband who couldn't be bothered to remember their anniversary. I typed my response. Yes, I'll testify. Whatever you need to put him away for a long time. The reply came quickly. Good. We'll make him regret the day he underestimated you. I smiled at that, feeling a fierce satisfaction settle in my bones. Nathan had made many mistakes, but his biggest had been assuming that because I was quiet, I was weak. Because I was patient, I was passive. Because I loved him, I would accept anything. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he'd been. The months between Nathan's arrest and the trial were a strange limbo of waiting and preparation. I moved through depositions and strategy sessions with Sarah Chen's team, recounting details of my marriage with the clinical detachment of someone describing a historical event rather than 3 years of her life. The prosecutor was brilliant, ruthless in her preparation, drilling me on every possible question the defense might ask, every angle they might use to discredit my testimony. They'll paint you as a scorned woman seeking revenge, she warned during one particularly grueling session in late March. They'll suggest you fabricated evidence or misinterpreted innocent business dealings because Nathan was unfaithful. You need to stay calm, stick to facts. Don't let them provoke an emotional response. I practiced my testimony until the words felt mechanical, drained of feeling. My name is Cassandra Carver. I was married to Nathan Carver for 3 years. I discovered evidence of illegal activities including money laundering, bribery, and fraud. I provided this evidence to federal authorities because I believed it was the right thing to do. Simple, factual, unassailable. But at night, alone in the Red Hook apartment that had become less sanctuary and more waiting room, the emotional reality was harder to manage. I dreamed of the penthouse sometimes, of the life I'd walked away from, not missing it exactly, but grieving the woman who'd believed in it. The woman who'd thought love was enough, that if she was patient and beautiful and accommodating, Nathan would eventually see her value and choose her over his empire and his appetites. Dominic became my anchor during those months, stopping by the apartment several evenings a week ostensibly to discuss business, but really, I suspected, to make sure I wasn't drowning in the isolation of my circumstances. We reviewed the properties he was positioning to acquire, planned the conversions and renovations, discussed hiring strategies, and market positioning. But we also talked about other things. His childhood in Milan before his family immigrated to New York. My college years studying art history, the thesis I'd abandoned halfway through about the use of domestic spaces in Renaissance painting. The books we'd read, the places we wanted to travel. The versions of ourselves we'd put aside to become who we currently were. Do you regret it? I asked him one evening in early May, as we shared takeout Thai food from containers spread across my coffee table. Getting into this life, I mean. Taking over your father's business instead of becoming an architect. Dominic was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. I regret that I didn't have more choices, he said finally. My father died when I was 23, and there were people depending on the business continuing, families who'd worked for us for generations. Walking away would have meant leaving them vulnerable to people like Nathan, who would have absorbed the territory and eliminated anyone loyal to my father. He met my eyes. But I don't regret building something lasting from what I inherited. I just wish it could have been on my own terms from the beginning. "And now?" I asked. "With these new ventures, the legitimate businesses, is that you getting back to what you wanted originally?" A smile curved his lips. "Maybe. Or maybe it's discovering what I want now is different from what I wanted at 23. Maybe it's finding that building something with the right partner matters more than building exactly what I'd imagined alone." The words hung in the air between us, laden with meaning. Neither of us was quite ready to address directly. We were still in the waiting period, still in the limbo between my old life ending and a new one beginning. I was still technically married to Nathan, still defined by his surname, still carrying the weight of 3 years I couldn't simply erase with divorce papers. But something was growing between Dominic and me, careful and slow, like a plant pushing through concrete. A recognition of compatibility, of shared values beneath our different exteriors, of the possibility that destruction and creation could coexist, that the same forces that brought down an empire could build a new one from its ashes. The trial began on June 15th as scheduled, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where security was tight and media presence was overwhelming. Nathan had retained a team of high-priced defense attorneys who argued for dismissal, for suppression of evidence, for anything that might derail the prosecution's case. But Sarah Chen was prepared for every maneuver, her case built on the foundation of months of investigation and testimony from multiple witnesses. I attended the trial but didn't testify in the first week, listening instead as forensic accountants explained money laundering schemes, as former associates described Nathan's methods of controlling territory and eliminating competition, as FBI agents detailed the evidence collected during the investigation. Nathan sat at the defense table in expensive suits, his expression carefully neutral, occasionally conferring with his attorneys but never looking toward the gallery where I sat surrounded by federal marshals. Brianna testified on day 8, via video link as planned, her face obscured and voice modulated to protect her new identity. She was nervous but credible, describing the 18-month affair with devastating honesty, recounting conversations where Nathan had boasted about outsmarting rivals and corrupting officials, detailing the gifts and promises he'd made to secure her loyalty. The defense tried to paint her as a money-hungry seductress who'd targeted a married man for financial gain. But Sarah Chen had anticipated the strategy. She introduced evidence of Brianna's modest background, her student loans and entry-level salary, the fact that Nathan had pursued her rather than the other way around. By the time Brianna's testimony concluded, the jury looked sympathetic rather than skeptical, seeing her as another of Nathan's victims rather than his accomplice. I was called to testify on day 12, a warm June morning when thunderstorms threatened but hadn't yet broken. I wore a navy suit that Dominic had helped me select, professional and understated, the kind of outfit that conveyed seriousness without drama. My wedding ring was absent, divorce proceedings having been initiated shortly after Nathan's arrest. The marriage officially dissolved 2 weeks before the trial began. Sarah Chen led me through my testimony with practiced efficiency. How I'd met Nathan, the courtship and marriage, the gradual realization that his businesses weren't what they appeared, the discovery of the pen drives, the decision to copy the information, the moment I'd decided to leave after seeing Brianna's Instagram post. "Why did you decide to provide this evidence to authorities?" Sarah Chen asked, her voice gentle but firm. I looked directly at the jury, 12 people who would decide Nathan's fate, who held in their hands the power to validate everything I'd sacrificed. Because I realized that the man I married didn't exist, that I'd been in love with a carefully constructed image rather than a real person. And because staying silent would have made me complicit in his crimes, would have meant accepting that some people are above consequences simply because they have money and power. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I wanted to believe in justice, in the idea that doing the right thing matters even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. The cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Sarah Chen had warned. Nathan's lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Moore, tried every angle to discredit me, suggested I'd fabricated evidence out of jealousy over the affair, Implied I'd seduced Dominic Castellano and partnered with him to eliminate Nathan as business competition. Questioned why I'd waited months to come forward if I'd truly discovered criminal evidence. But I'd been prepared, had practiced staying calm and factual, had learned to deflect attempts to provoke emotional responses. When Patricia Moore suggested I'd married Nathan for his money and turned on him when I found a wealthier protector, I looked her in the eye and said quietly, "I married Nathan because I believed he loved me. I left him because I realized he was incapable of loving anyone more than he loved power and control. The evidence I provided was real, verifiable, and documented by federal investigators. My motivations don't change the facts of his crimes." The jury's faces told me they believed me, or at least found me more credible than the defense's narrative. When I was finally dismissed after 2 days of testimony, I felt hollowed out but also lighter, as though speaking the truth publicly had lanced some infected wound I'd been carrying. Dominic was waiting outside the courtroom when I emerged, his presence solid and reassuring among the chaos of reporters and security. He didn't say anything, just offered his arm, and I took it, letting him guide me through the crowd to a waiting car that whisked us away from the courthouse toward a destination he wouldn't name. We drove north, out of Manhattan, and into Westchester County, finally pulling up to a small Italian restaurant I didn't recognize, tucked away on a quiet street, in a town whose name I'd already forgotten. Dominic had reserved a private dining room in the back, away from windows and prying eyes, a sanctuary where we could decompress without performance or observation. "You did well today," he said once we were seated, wine poured and menus ignored on the table between us. "Better than well. You were credible, composed, unshakable. The jury believed you." "It doesn't matter if they believed me," I said, exhaustion making me honest. "It matters if they convict him, if they decide the evidence is strong enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life." "They will," Dominic said with certainty. "The case is too strong, the witnesses too credible, the documentation too thorough. Nathan will be convicted, Cassandra. And when he is, you'll finally be free." Free. The word felt foreign, like a concept I'd read about but never experienced firsthand. I'd gone from my parents' house to college to Nathan's penthouse, always belonging to someone or something, always defined by relationships rather than existing independently. The idea of freedom, of autonomy, of building a life based entirely on my own choices, was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "What if I don't know how to be free?" I asked, voicing the fear I'd been carrying. "What if I've spent so long being someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's witness, that I don't know how to just be Cassandra?" Dominic reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Then you figure it out, one choice at a time. You already started by leaving Nathan, by providing evidence, by testifying. Those were all choices you made independently, based on your own values and judgment. The rest is just continuing in that direction. With you?" I asked, needing to know where we stood now that the trial was nearly over, now that the thing that had brought us together was reaching its conclusion. His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand, the gesture intimate and tender. "If you want." I meant what I said about the business partnership, about building something legitimate together. But I also meant the part about waiting until you're ready, until you've had time to discover who you are without Nathan's influence. He paused, his dark eyes holding mine. "I'm not going anywhere, Cassandra. I'll be here whether you're ready tomorrow or next year or never. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hoping for tomorrow." The honesty in his words, the patient desire, made something crack in my carefully maintained composure. I'd spent months being strong, being strategic, being everything the situation required. But here, in this quiet room with this man who'd stood beside me through the worst period of my life, I could finally let myself feel the full weight of everything I'd been carrying. Tears came, sudden and unexpected, spilling down my cheeks despite my attempts to hold them back. Dominic was there immediately, moving from his side of the table to mine, pulling me against his chest, and letting me cry into his expensive shirt while he murmured soft reassurances in Italian, words I didn't understand but that soothed anyway, through their gentle cadence. When the storm finally passed, leaving me wrung out and empty, but also cleansed, I pulled back enough to look at him. "I'm sorry," I said, embarrassed by the emotional display. "Don't be," he replied, using his thumb to wipe away the tears still clinging to my cheeks. "You've been holding everything together for months, being strong when you had every right to fall apart. You're entitled to break a little, especially with someone who won't judge you for it." "Is that what you are?" I asked. "Someone who won't judge me?" "I'm someone who sees you," Dominic said simply. "Not as Nathan's wife or as a witness or as a victim, but as Cassandra. Intelligent, brave, capable of extraordinary things when given the chance. That's who I see, and that's who I want to build something with, whether it's just business or something more." The kiss happened naturally, inevitably, his lips meeting mine with a gentleness that made my heart ache. It was nothing like kissing Nathan had been, nothing performative or possessive about it. This was exploration, question and answer, a tentative bridge between what we'd been and what we might become. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Dominic rested his forehead against mine. "Too soon?" he asked, concern threading through his voice. "Maybe," I admitted. "But maybe also exactly right. Maybe I've spent too long waiting for the perfect moment instead of recognizing that the right moment is the one where you're brave enough to choose what you want." "And what do you want, Cassandra?" I thought about the question, about the woman I'd been 6 months ago waiting by the phone, about the woman I'd become through the process of dismantling my old life, about the woman I wanted to be going forward. "I want to build something real," I said finally. "Something honest and earned, not given to me by a man who saw me as a possession. I want to be your partner, in business and maybe eventually in life, if we can figure out how to make that work." I pulled back enough to meet his eyes, but I also need time to learn how to stand alone before I can properly stand beside someone. Does that make sense? "Perfect sense," Dominic said, smiling. "We'll take it slow, build the business first. Let the rest develop naturally as you figure out your own footing. I'm patient, Cassandra. I've waited 2 years to get revenge on Nathan. I can wait however long it takes for you to be ready for something more." The trial concluded 3 weeks later with a guilty verdict on all counts. Nathan showed no emotion as the jury foreman read each one, his face a mask of careful neutrality, even as his world collapsed around him. Sentencing was scheduled for August, but everyone knew he'd receive the maximum, 25 years to life for the RICO charges alone, more when the other convictions were factored in. I watched from the gallery as marshals led him away in handcuffs, this man I'd promised to love forever. This stranger who'd used me and discarded me and now would spend what remained of his life in a federal prison. I waited to feel triumph, satisfaction, the sweet taste of revenge fully realized. Instead, I felt only closure. The ending of something that had needed to end, the final page of a chapter I could now leave behind. Dominic was beside me, his hand finding mine as we stood to leave. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "Free," I said, and meant it. Finally. Actually free. We walked out of the courthouse together, into the bright August sunshine, toward whatever future we would build from the ashes of everything that had burned. 2 years. That's how long it took for the dust to settle completely, for Nathan's empire to be fully dismantled and parceled out, for the legal proceedings to conclude, and the media attention to fade. 2 years during which I learned who Cassandra was when she wasn't defined by Nathan's shadow, or the mission to destroy him. The business partnership with Dominic flourished beyond either of our expectations. The warehouse conversion in Red Hook that had been one of his first proposals became a boutique hotel that won architectural awards and operated at 90% occupancy year-round. The restaurant in Brooklyn evolved into a small chain of 3 locations, each featuring locally sourced ingredients and employing people from the neighborhood, giving opportunities to those who needed them most. We acquired 6 of Nathan's former properties at auction, transforming them from money laundering fronts into legitimate enterprises. A shipping company that had been used to smuggle contraband now moved legal goods with proper documentation and fair labor practices. A construction firm that had specialized in bribing inspectors now built affordable housing that passed every code. An import business that had trafficked in stolen art now dealt in legally authenticated pieces and partnered with museums for traveling exhibitions. I found my footing in the work, discovering talents I hadn't known I possessed. I was good at seeing potential in broken things, at imagining how spaces could be reimagined and repurposed. My art history degree, abandoned and gathering dust, became relevant again as I curated collections for the hotel and consulted on gallery partnerships. The attention to detail I'd developed as Nathan's wife, noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing, translated into strategic planning and risk assessment that saved us from costly mistakes. Dominic and I worked side by side through it all, equal partners in every sense. We argued sometimes, passionate debates about direction and strategy that left us both energized rather than angry. We celebrated victories together, opening each new venture with champagne toasts and quiet satisfaction. We supported each other through setbacks, the permits that didn't come through, the contractors who cut corners, the unexpected expenses that threatened timelines. And slowly, carefully, we built something personal alongside the professional. Dinners that started as working meetings evolved into actual dates. Good night texts became good morning calls. The careful distance we'd maintained began to close, inch by careful inch, until the night I invited him to stay after he'd walked me home from a gallery opening, and he'd said yes without hesitation. Making love with Dominic was nothing like the mechanical coupling I'd experienced with Nathan. This was discovery, genuine interest in my pleasure and my responses, patience and tenderness mixed with passion that left us both breathless and laughing in the tangled sheets of my bed. Afterward, he'd held me close, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my shoulder while we talked until dawn about everything and nothing, building intimacy through words and silence in equal measure. "Move in with me," he'd said, as morning light filtered through the windows. "Not because it's practical or convenient, but because I want to wake up next to you every day. Because I want to build a life with you, not just a business." I'd said yes without hesitation, recognizing the rightness of it, how different this choice felt from the decision to marry Nathan. This wasn't about security or image or filling a void. This was about actively choosing partnership with someone who saw me clearly and still wanted me, who challenged me to be better while accepting exactly who I was. We moved into a townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, a compromise between Dominic's preference for Manhattan and my need for space away from the penthouse's ghost. We furnished it together, arguing good-naturedly over artwork and furniture, creating a home that reflected both of us, rather than one person's vision imposed on the other. The first year passed in a blur of work and building, our relationship developing alongside our empire. We traveled when we could, spending a long weekend in Montreal, a week in Iceland, always working even on vacation, but choosing to work together on things we cared about. We hosted dinners for our growing circle of friends, people from the neighborhood and the business world, creating community where before there had been only isolation. Nathan's sentencing in that first August gave him 28 years, ensuring he'd be in his 60s before he was eligible for parole. I didn't attend the hearing, having said everything I needed to say during the trial. Dominic went, though, representing both of us, and returned with news that Nathan had looked diminished somehow, the prison jumpsuit and institutional setting stripping away the veneer of power he'd always worn like armor. "He asked about you," Dominic had said that evening as we shared wine on our brownstone's roof deck, the city sparkling below us. "Wanted to know if you were happy." "What did you tell him?" That happiness wasn't something you owed him information about. That you'd moved on and built a life that had nothing to do with him. Dominic had paused, then added more quietly, "But for what it's worth, I hope you are happy. With the work, with us, with everything you've created." I'd considered the question seriously, looking inward with the kind of honest assessment I'd learned through therapy and time. "I am," I'd said finally. "Not perfectly, not without complications, but genuinely happy in a way I didn't know was possible. Is that strange? To find happiness in the ruins of my worst mistakes?" "I think it's human," Dominic had replied. "We don't get to choose the circumstances that shape us, only how we respond to them. You responded by building something better. That's not strange, Cassandra. That's remarkable." The proposal came during our second winter together, on New Year's Eve, as we watched fireworks over the East River from our roof. Dominic had been quieter than usual all evening, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was working up courage for something. "Marry me," he'd said, as the final explosions painted the sky in gold and silver. "Not because it's what people do, or because it makes business sense, but because I want to spend my life with you. Because you've made me believe in partnership and trust, and the possibility that two people can build something together that's stronger than what either could create alone." He'd produced a ring then, not a massive diamond like Nathan had given me, but an elegant sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds, the setting vintage and unique. "I had it made from a stone my grandmother brought from Italy," he'd explained. "Something old, something with history, because I think we both understand that the past matters even as we build the future." I'd said yes through happy tears, sliding the ring onto my finger and marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt to be choosing this again, with full knowledge of what marriage meant and who I was within it. We married 6 months later in Tuscany, in a small ceremony at a villa overlooking vineyards that had been producing wine since before Columbus sailed. Just us, Dominic's sister and her family, and a handful of close friends who'd supported us through the transition. No media, no social performance, just genuine celebration of commitment freely chosen. I wore a simple cream silk dress that felt like me, carried wildflowers from the villa's garden, and spoke vows we'd written ourselves about partnership and growth, about loving the person someone is while supporting who they're becoming. Dominic had cried when I'd promised to stand beside him through whatever came, to be his equal partner in building dreams and weathering storms, and his tears had made mine flow freely as well. The reception was held at a long table under string lights and stars, featuring food prepared by the villa's chef from ingredients grown on the property. We danced to a single song, Dominic holding me close while the small orchestra played, his lips brushing my temple as he murmured, "Thank you for choosing me, for taking a chance on building something together." "Thank you for waiting," I'd replied, "for giving me time to figure out who I was before asking me to be someone's wife again, for seeing me as a partner rather than a possession." Our honeymoon was spent traveling through Italy, visiting the places Dominic remembered from childhood, creating new memories in the spaces where his old ones lived. We talked about the future during long dinners in small trattorias, about expanding the business into other cities, about maybe starting a family if that was something I wanted, about the 1,000 small and large ways we might continue building our life together. "Do you ever regret it?" Dominic asked one evening, as we sat on our hotel balcony overlooking Lake Como. "Everything that happened, the choices you made, the destruction of your marriage, if you could go back and do it differently, would you?" I'd thought about Nathan's Instagram post that had started everything, about the humiliation and rage I'd felt seeing him with Brianna while I sat alone on our anniversary, about the months of planning, and the trial, and the slow reconstruction of myself from the pieces he'd left behind. "I regret marrying him in the first place," I'd said honestly. "I regret not seeing who he was before I committed my life to him. But I don't regret leaving or providing evidence or any of the choices I made after that moment of clarity. Those choices led me here, to you, to a life I actually want, rather than one I settled for because I didn't know better was possible. "And now?" he'd asked. "What do you want now?" I'd looked at this man who'd stood beside me through transformation, who'd offered partnership when I'd expected judgment, who'd waited patiently while I learned to stand on my own before standing beside him. "This," I'd said simply. "I want this life we're building, this partnership we've created, this future we're imagining together. I want to keep growing the business, keep transforming broken things into beautiful ones, keep learning who we can be together." I'd paused, then added more softly, "And maybe I want a family, children we can raise together to value honesty and partnership, and the courage to leave situations that diminish them." Dominic's smile had been radiant, full of joy and promise. "Then that's what we'll build. All of it. Together." We returned to New York with renewed purpose, throwing ourselves into expanding the business while also beginning conversations about starting a family. The 3rd anniversary of Nathan's arrest passed without fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement between us that we'd come far from that moment of rupture and revenge. I thought about Nathan sometimes, wondered if he reflected on his choices in the isolation of prison, if he understood what he'd lost through his arrogance and cruelty. But mostly I didn't think about him at all. He'd become a footnote in my story rather than its central character, a cautionary tale about the danger of losing yourself in someone else's narrative. The woman I'd been, waiting by the phone for a husband who couldn't be bothered to remember their anniversary, felt like a stranger now. She'd been so small, I realized, so diminished by her own choice to accept less than she deserved, because she didn't know she could demand more. I felt compassion for her, that younger version of myself, but also gratitude that she'd found the courage to leave, to choose destruction over continued diminishment. On a warm June evening, 4 years after Nathan's arrest, Dominic and I stood on the roof of our Brooklyn Heights townhouse, looking out over the city that had witnessed both my destruction and reconstruction. His arm was around my waist, my hand resting on my gently swelling abdomen where our daughter grew. A new life created from love and partnership rather than manipulation and control. "Happy?" he asked, the question he'd asked countless times. Always checking, always making sure I was choosing this life rather than simply accepting it. "Deliriously," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "You?" "More than I ever thought possible," he said, his hand covering mine on my belly, both of us connected to the future we were creating. "Thank you for taking a chance on us, on building something new from everything that burned." I looked at the lights of Manhattan sparkling across the river, at the empire we'd built together from the ashes of Nathan's downfall, at the life we'd chosen with full knowledge and honest intention. "Thank you for seeing me," I said, "for waiting while I learned to see myself, for being the kind of partner who makes marriage feel like freedom rather than captivity." We stood together as the sun set and the city lights began to glow. 2 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of destruction and chosen to build something better. The past would always be part of our story, the choices we'd made, and the consequences we'd weathered. But it didn't define us, didn't limit what we could become or create together. That night, as we lay in bed with Dominic's hand resting on my belly and our daughter kicking against his palm, I thought about the Instagram post that had shattered my world 4 years earlier. About Brianna's smiling face and Nathan's casual dismissal of my worth. About the rage and humiliation that had driven me to Dominic's office with nothing but revenge in my heart. And I felt grateful, strangely and genuinely grateful for that moment of absolute clarity, for the destruction that had forced me to rebuild myself into someone stronger and more honest. For the path that had led me here, to this bed, to this man, to this life I'd chosen rather than settled for. Sometimes I thought as sleep claimed me, the best revenge isn't destruction at all. It's building something so beautiful, so genuine, so perfectly yours, that the person who tried to diminish you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. Nathan had his prison sentence, his empire in ruins, his reputation destroyed. But my revenge, the one that truly mattered, was this. I was happy. Genuinely. Completely. Freely happy in a way I'd never been with him. And he would spend the rest of his life knowing that the wife he'd dismissed as irrelevant had not only destroyed him, but had built something better from the ruins. Something he could never touch or diminish or take away. That was victory. That was freedom. That was the future I'd chosen. And it was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined in those dark days of planning his downfall. The past was done. The revenge was complete. And now, finally, beautifully, I could simply live.